summer before last, my former brother-in-law, who has remained relatively close to our extended family for many, many years since his divorce from my sister somewhere back in the 1970s, made what seemed at the time to be a very odd request. He wanted some private time with each of the family units, beginning with his now grown-up daughter in California, another daughter in Michigan, my sister also in Michigan, and Carol and me in Maryland. He had a confession to make. He had been drafted into the Vietnam War, I think out of graduate school, and as far as anyone knew, including everyone in the family, including my sister, to whom he was married at the time, and the two daughters that I have just mentioned, who were very small children at the time. As far as we knew, he had served at Fort Bragg and then was sent to Hawaii. And I recall that there was some mild joking at the time that it seemed like a pretty plush assignment. As far as any of us knew, he never saw any actual combat at all. Well, it turns out that he was indeed in Hawaii, but that he was sent at one point with a special task force on a secret mission, a very quick one, to Vietnam and to the Mekong Delta. And he was there for only about 2 weeks. His squadron walked into an ambush in a village that was apparently an enemy stronghold, and in the midst of heavy gunfire and explosions, he escaped into a small hut and found himself face to face with a young woman, probably a teenager, who was holding a baby in her arms and a knife in her right hand. He hesitated a moment, and then he shot and killed both of them. For 45 years, he lived privately with that pain. And in therapy, which had occurred over a long, extended period of time, he began to share that experience. So now, even though there is a partial explanation for the episodes of depression so many years ago that we knew he was having, and a destruction of a marriage that probably wasn't that good to begin with, the experience cuts much deeper. Like Michael Yandel, he was morally injured. In his own mind and heart, he had betrayed himself. And yet I think that there is much more to all of this than we are usually willing to admit. We in our culture have sanitized experiences like this with the psychological designation of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, as if to say that the problem is the inability of specific individuals to adjust and adapt to the harsh realities of war and the violence that is inherent in it. After all, the argument goes, millions upon millions in all of the wars of history have seemingly adjusted just fine. I suspect that is really not the case, however, and that it is more accurate to suggest that some people cope better than others, some are better at suppressing the pain and the anguish of the psyche than others. War is hell. And there should be no shame whatsoever in feeling its pain and its pathos, let alone its contradictions. Indeed, I would suggest and this is very difficult, I would suggest that paradoxically, PTSD is a profound signal that integrity and moral underpinnings are alive still and clamoring to function. And the so-called disorder is like a fever pointing to an underlying disease, namely the dehumanizing of the enemy, and calling it, as Michael Yandel puts it, a quality of character. And what we have called a disorder is surely painful, and it needs to be treated, but it is fundamentally a sign of integrity not destroyed, of principle injured, but not totally defeated, a sign of deep, deep despair, but also of hope. The problem is that integrity and principle and hope will continue to be partially trapped, unable to function fully because of a much larger corporate system and mentality that beats them down at every turn. The problem is that moral injury is not just simply a personal issue that manifests itself as PTSD, but is a corporate systemic problem that is deeply embedded in our culture and worldview and affects all of us because we are largely complicit in allowing it to occur in the first place. We have betrayed ourselves by allowing our leaders to sanction actions in the name of national security and patriotism that are clearly counter to what we stand for, what we say we stand for as a people. In 2003, while President Bush was announcing on a battleship the liberation of Iraq, what a farce that turned out to be, the media was showing images to all of the world of Abu Ghraib, where prisoners were being abused systematically. The late Susan Sontag, writing in the New York Times about the photos, described the efforts of low-ranking GIs to depict Iraqi prisoners as bestial, craven, dehumanized. We are high, they are low. We are clean, they are dirty. We are strong and brave, they are weak and cowardly. We are lordly, they are animals. We are God's chosen, they are estranged from everything divine. And Sontag goes on to write, the photos are us. Nazis were not the only ones to commit atrocities. Americans do so too, when they are led to believe that the people that they are torturing belong to an inferior, despicable race or religion. Now, to be fair, our leaders did do something about Abu Ghraib, but only when it was exposed by witnesses who had qualms of conscience and who couldn't stand it anymore. But it turns out that Abu Ghraib was merely the tip of a much bigger iceberg. Enter the CIA and Cheney and company and psychologists and lawyers wanting to find ways to use enhanced interrogation techniques legally. In other words, by any other name, torture of prisoners in order to get information. Torture. Torture. It is not as though we have not known about clearly illegal acts for a long time, but the released Senate Intelligence Committee report makes it abundantly clear. And esteemed members of the committee, both Democrat and Republican, have known for years and years. From every perspective, the depravity, the obscenity, the barbarism, the illegality has been clear. Waterboarding, rectal feeding, sleep deprivation, prolonged periods of cold and nakedness, hanging by wrists, in short, every defined crime against humanity imaginable, exercised in our name to supposedly protect us. The clear and flagrant violation of international protocols outlined in the Geneva Convention and operative as sequel to the atrocities of Nazi Germany as prosecuted during the Nuremberg trials has been on display as part of our collective war on terror. The New York Times has called for prosecution of torturers and their bosses in its editorials. Obama, much to his discredit, I think, has said we must look forward, not backward, as if we cannot do both. Have we not learned yet that to brush aside for any reason the history of the past means that we will one day repeat it? He says that torture techniques have stopped. I'm not so certain. He says that is not who we are. Unfortunately, to echo Susan Sontag, that is who we are, or at least who many of us are. And many of us who are repulsed by policies and acts that are reprehensible, we are morally injured. And we want to be healed, but healing cannot take place unless and until there is some kind of accountability. There is now the very tired argument of efficacy regarding the so-called war on terror. This has changed things. We may not like torture, but it is necessary because it works. The minor difficulty with that argument is that the evidence indicates rather conclusively that it doesn't work. But the major argument against it, however, is that it is morally injurious, not to the enemy, but to us. It violates who many of us say we are. Are we then not the persons who should be doing something about this? It has occurred to me over and over again as I have struggled with this sermon that we live in a culture where many of us are so inured of violence that it really doesn't matter one way or the other to them. Just as so many are inured by bigotry that they don't want to be confronted by it. There are many others, however, who stand in some kind of middle ground. Perhaps it's the majority of people in this land. Some of my very beloved friends to whom I've talked. Yeah, they say, it's all pretty bad and horrible, but there really isn't anything we can do about it. Our leaders are not receptive to any kind of analysis of change. And finally, there are those here and about who take talk about the inherent worth and dignity of all people seriously, who look at relationships on a personal level and a corporate level as requiring compassion and justice and equity, who really do believe in a world community where there is peace and justice and liberty, who believe that achieving those goals requires means that live up to our ethical standards, and to use unethical means to accomplish good ends or even noble ends causes moral injury. This is what those who use the efficacy argument don't seem to understand. Destroying the soul of a people to provide supposed security is metaphorical death. We are acknowledging now the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. Documentaries reveal again and again the horrific nature of the Holocaust. And what has struck me yet one more time about all of that is the deliberate acquiescence of so many of the people to the atrocities occurring right in their midst, sometimes no more than a few thousand yards away. The trite phrase, "go along to get along," hardly captures the irresponsibility of relative silence in the face of the greatest evil of modern times. My confession now is that this is perhaps the most depressing and maybe difficult sermon that I have ever preached, and I have preached thousands of times. I said in the introduction to this service that it would be X-rated emotionally. And I have to confess that writing this sermon and preaching it now is an extremely draining experience. But I cannot be content to leave myself and any of you in a state of injury. So let me be the provocateur for a moment, and let me suggest some ways forward. First, we need to break the relative silence on this issue. Here at UUCF, where we really haven't talked about it at all, and I'm embarrassed about that. We need to talk about it in our personal conversations. We need to talk about it in groups with whom we are affiliated. But secondly, in the larger court of human opinion, it needs to be made clear that much of what our officials have done since 9/11 especially, we consider to be immoral, counterproductive, and injurious to many of us, if not all, even though we don't realize it in the larger sense. In this regard, it is perhaps not useful or prudent, in spite of the call by the New York Times to seek prosecution of those who have so obviously broken the law. Rather, we might find ways to struggle to one at the same time fully expose more analytically the wrongs committed in our name, but then exercise a degree of forgiveness to all and to even ourselves, whether they want it or we want it. I know that millions around the world were deeply moved and inspired by what Desmond Tutu accomplished in South Africa with the amnesty program. It seems to me a model worth adapting in creative and imaginative ways. It can be a way of saying, never again, never again. But also of saying, we're starting afresh to try one more time to get it right. And I invite you to join me in that endeavor, because I am not willing to leave this issue alone. Third, and perhaps most important of all, we must never lose sight of the larger picture within which moral injury is set. I have been reading Karen Armstrong's book, it's a tome, Fields of Blood. I recommend it highly to you. It is brilliant, but it is not an easy read. And she says at the end of her tour de force, when we confront the violence of our time, it is natural to harden our hearts to global pain and deprivation that makes us feel so uncomfortable, depressed, and frustrated. Yet we must find ways of contemplating these depressing facts of modern life, or we will lose the best part of our humanity. Somehow, we need to find ways of doing what religion, at its very best, has done for centuries. Build a sense of global community. Cultivate a sense of reverence and equanimity for all, and take responsibility for all of the suffering in the world. so may it be.